Bioware's general manager Gary McKay has issued a statement on their own blog confirming a downsizing of Bioware as a developer and a redistribution of staff amongst other EA projects. Now this is spun as a positive with the whole idea of redistributing people, trying to play to their strengths, trying to put staff to work on other things within EA. However, there is a lot more to break down here, and I'm nothing but worried about the future of Bioware after this, even though the overall message is don't worry guys, we're assigning a bunch of veterans to the future of the studio, to Mass Effect. Don't worry, it's all going to be okay. I don't know if it is. Now this is spun as a positive with a set of Mass Effect series veterans staying behind at Bioware to continue working on the next Mass Effect game, whilst assumedly hundreds of developers have either been laid off or reassigned. At time of recording, those numbers aren't public, but as of 2019, Bioware was made up of 320 people, with IGN reporting now that some Dragon Age staff have been made redundant. And McKay himself only mentions a literal handful of individuals are representing Bioware overall. Those include executive producer Mike Gamble, who did work on Mass Effect 2, Mass Effect Trilogy lead designer Preston Watamanuik, original Mass Effect art director Derek Watts, and lead cinematic animator Parish Lay. This team is also joined by former Deus Ex and Guardians of the Galaxy writer Mary DeMarle. Quick aside, you should go play the Guardians of the Galaxy game. There's so much more I'm going to get to for Mass Effect, but I know that the new Guardians of the Galaxy deserves your love. That thing is actually surprisingly brilliant, and it was only killed because the Avengers game was so bad. I feel like the stink of the Avengers game carried over to Guardians of the Galaxy, and to be honest, if you want a bit of a Mass Effect hit, it's actually in the Guardians of the Galaxy game. Walking around that ship, talking to your different crew members, there's a lot of Mass Effect DNA in there. I know that game's already bombed, that was years ago, but I'm just saying, good games are good games, and Guardians is one of them. Anyway, in theory, this is a strong foundation going forward, but the timeline on the game's development is worrying as hell. The next Mass Effect was first unveiled in 2020, including various teasers as to the future of the franchise, mentioning another arc being sent across the cosmos, showing the destruction of the mass relays, and showing a returning Liara T'Soni finding what looked like Commander Shepard's armor, alongside a new band of characters comprising various races. It confirmed Bioware were attempting, despite how much people hated the close of Mass Effect 3 and all of Andromeda, to continue where they initially left off in 2012. Attached to this 2020 trailer is text reading that a veteran team at Bioware is in the early stages of what is on the horizon for the Mass Effect franchise, and we are excited to show you where we'll be heading next. 2023 did see a teaser for the new game on November 7th, showing a helmeted character in a long coat, and 2024's N7 Day had that coat then put into Dragon Age the Veilguard as a free update, but that's it. Speaking to IGN, Bioware have said this drastically reduced headcount is the right number of people in the right roles to work on Mass Effect at this stage of development, implying we're essentially back to square one. Bioware also say that given this stage of development, we don't require support from the full studio, and this comes after Bioware laid off 50 people at the close of 2023. The overall message is, we're doing what we can with what we've got. For the love of God, we're not shutting down, at least not officially. We're just doing what we can. There's some people still here who have been here for a long time. Clearly, these individuals still care a hell of a lot about Mass Effect, and that should be championed. However, I do think there is that wider conversation on just what the living hell you can even do with the Mass Effect IP, which I'm going to get to, but I still think that overall it's alarm bells, it's alarm sirens, and as good as a spin on not necessarily layoffs in the Dragon Age department, but redistribution of staff is, as good as a spin that this is, the reality is that you have a fraction, a skeleton crew of who was originally working at Bioware going forward on what is now their most important release overall. A lot of people were pinning a lot of hopes onto Dragon Age the Veilguard. Personally, I really enjoyed that game. I totally get the qualms with the way that it's written, but I think it plays phenomenally well. A lot of people were thinking, okay, if Dragon Age doesn't hit, then what the hell happens to Bioware? They seem to have skirted through that. It apparently missed expectations by 50%. EA wanted 3 million players, apparently had 1.5 million, which it is also crazy that 1.5 million players is still considered, bad or not enough or whatever. But that game is largely sort of, regarded as a bit of a failure in the eyes of its publisher, in the eyes of EA. So now it's all eyes on Mass Effect, and whether this new approach actually works is the whole thing. Like, Bioware are one of those studios that you can look at and apply the WandaVision style Ship of Theseus thing, where they've had so many different developers rotate over the last 20 plus years. However, there is a tiny pocket of people here that I just mentioned that have been there since the mid 2000s and even before then. General Manager Gary McKay states, "We have incredible talent here and we are taking this opportunity between full development cycles to reimagine how we work." again, it's kind of crazy that we're talking about a game, in between full development cycles when it was announced 5 years ago, when they did a teaser 2 years ago at the end of 2023 that in theory was in-engine as well. That was the conversation back at the end of 2023, this was the new vision for Mass Effect, the long coat, the helmet, this is a new character, whatever it is, new signature pistol, whatever you want to point at. Now we're in between full development cycles. Now we're starting the next Mass Effect 5 years in. If you're one of those team members, it's dealing with big overarching bureaucratic corporate BS is one of the most life-draining things you can partake in as a human on this earth, and having to try and get something over the finish line for 5 years. And even the thing you get over the finish line is just, can we actually do this? That's insane. Like, if you go back into the history of when Dragon Age, the Veilguard was first announced, back when it was called Dreadwolf, that apparently internally was Bioware saying, put the teaser out there, make people aware of this game, because they were still dealing with the fallout from Mass Effect Andromeda, from the fallout from what was leading into Anthem at the time as well. And they needed some goodwill. They needed something to say, some general conversation around Bioware that would prevent them being shut down back then. So I feel like they've been, held together by string and goodwill for a good long while now. McKay wants Bioware to be a more agile, focused studio that produces unforgettable RPGs. However, I say, how do you do that without the wider pool of developer experience? That's just up in the air. Assumedly, the plan will be to hire back up once this version of Bioware knows what the next Mass Effect is and how to get there, but we're talking about another few years, maybe even another console generation before it sees the light of day. It's worth throwing in here that Anthem 2.0 was cancelled after the disastrous launch of the game in 2019, and a consistent drop-off of player retention even when plans to juice the game back up were announced. Anthem was released in 2019, bombed, 2.0 was announced in 2020, and then the whole thing was cancelled in 2022. I really want to believe, I really do, some of my fondest memories in gaming history are associated with Bioware, specifically Knights of the Old Republic, especially the Mass Effect trilogy, and I even loved Jade Empire. I want nothing more than a fully functioning Bioware with a passion and the ability to deliver on that passion. This just feels like a corporate hack job to maintain some level of, oh no, Bioware's fine, we're keeping going. And like I said, the veterans that are attached to this project have the most, goodwill, the most experience there. But the future of this studio and the future of these IPs, that's what's way up in the air. How the hell do you restaff to get a couple of hundred people are going to come in and get this thing over the finish line in the next few years? Maybe, but it still seems like very rocky terrain. Hopefully they do bring it together. The last thing that I want to touch on is just that idea of, do people even want this? Do people actually want a new Mass Effect? It's been 13 years since Mass Effect 3 and 7 years, or 8 years now since Mass Effect Andromeda. Neither of them, the end of Mass Effect 3 was one of the biggest controversies at the time. Bioware received so much flack back then, and even then it was a much stronger version of Bioware. They received so much flack for that game's ending, for the way that those different choices didn't play out, that they were forced, quote unquote, to do a cut content DLC. They were like, oh, here's a different version of the ending. We're recanonizing the way it's going to come together. And obviously, if you look into that as the years played out, there were various comments, interviews with members of Bioware who confirmed that game's development was an absolute mess, who confirmed that they had a different version, the way the story was going to go. They had to change it. EA were getting involved. The various different parts of the game's story were monetized and separated for DLC. Characters like Yavik, who are fundamental to the story, were put on separate paid DLC. They had the whole multiplayer suite. You had the original founders of Bioware leaving. It was a whole thing. I feel like they've been in a tailspin to a degree since then. And then the 2010s had Dragon Age Inquisition, which was received positively enough, but not as much as DA1. And then Anthem and Mass Effect Andromeda, and here we are. So I feel like you go back over the last 15 years and you go, do people even want a new Mass Effect? The idea of that is sweet, but I have no idea what the hell you do story-wise, especially if we're going off the teaser that was shown in 2020. It's done. Like, how do you continue the end of Mass Effect 3? The relays are all broken, everything is fractured. Andromeda was a way to go, but I don't know if people even want this. Do you care about Mass Effect in the modern day? I do, but my love of it is coming from that original trilogy. It is the Legendary Edition that they put out a few years ago, and it is the Mass Effect novels. I think the lore itself is great. I'm just so apprehensive of them bringing that stuff together. And do you continue? Do you want to play as Commander Shepard again? Do you want them to make a game where you bring your version of Shepard over and you keep going after the whole galaxy's been thrown sideways? Maybe they can find a way to do something compelling there. I'm very believe it when I see it. as a person, but I will definitely believe it when I see it, when Mass Effect actually returns and is confident enough. The last thing I want to touch on is just the reality of Bioware over the years. You have a studio that used to major in writing, storytelling, and decision making, character building, immersion. Gameplay was always second or third down that rung, if not fifth or 10th or something, if you want to go back to the Knights of the Old Republic. And why we played those games and why we loved them so much, it was not necessarily the gameplay. Nothing wrong with it, but it wasn't why we went there. Over the years, especially since EA stepped in and took them over, we had such a push towards gameplay systems. And something like Dragon Age the Veilguard, like I mentioned before, plays phenomenally well, especially if you play as a mage. There are so many different ways that you can approach combat, all these different combos that you can do, different effects and elementals that you can combo off each other. Really, really cool systems. Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem both played incredibly well. It was everything else that messed those games up. You can reshuffle the order of what felt like it was being prioritized and what it feels like, those elements that are then associated with BioWare. And so going forward, how do you tap back into the legacy of BioWare? Do you do something that is more story focused and dialogue driven and choice driven, or do you have something that has repeatable gameplay loops, and do you focus on that? Personally, I think that Dragon Age the Veilguard got most of that right. It was just in the way that certain characters were written, the general tone, the MCU Disney style stuff, the quips, the fact that even when you were writing your character Rook in a certain way, even if you were playing as a more serious, straight-laced character, they would still kind of break that tonality to get the little quip in and get the mass appeal joke in there. And I think that was the big problem with Veilguard overall, for those who even did get in there and play it, alongside all the lore inconsistencies, the people who would deep dive on that stuff. I realized just how much it didn't necessarily continue as best of a way as it could. My overall point is that over the years, BioWare have struggled with their identity. They've struggled with story-focused games and gameplay-focused games, repeatable monetization then attached to those gameplay systems in the multiplayer suites for something like Mass Effect, and then giving the multiplayer team on Mass Effect 3 access to Andromeda, which then meant that game played well, but the rest of it, the meat wasn't really there in terms of the character depth, the nuance, the thematics, etc. That's where we're at. We have the business reality shrinking the team down to an absolute skeleton crew. You have what is assumedly an identity crisis internally, pressure from EA, the top down, saying, what kind of game are you guys even going to do? And somewhere in there is a team of 5 or 6 veterans who have been there back when the terrain was a much easier thing to navigate, saying, we'd just like to make a Mass Effect game. Can we actually do that? Who knows?